Welcome to New World Now, where host Kim Corbin has compelling conversations with authors published by New World Library. They will discuss their personal journeys and share practical tools we can use to be more aware, mindful, and present in our daily lives. Now, here's your host, Kim Corbin.
When my guest today, Sandra Marinella, faced breast cancer in 2012, she left her lifelong job as a writing teacher and turned her focus toward writing as a way of healing. Inspired, she dug out and read 27 of her old journals. Through that process, she realized the level to which her own expressive journal writing had helped see her through previous life challenges, like the tragic death of her brother, postpartum depression, an extremely challenging boss, and more. She began volunteering with veterans and cancer patients, and as she watched their writing help them transform, she discovered her new passion, empowering others to use writing to heal and change their lives, which is the subject of her book we'll be discussing today, called The Story You Need to Tell, Writing to Heal from Trauma, Illness, or Loss. In the introduction to The Story You Need to Tell, Sandra shares that as many as 81% of us feel we have a book within us, a story to tell. This is something I can personally relate to as someone who has spent much of the last 18 years struggling to write about my story of starting a worldwide skipping movement in a cohesive and meaningful way. And I'm happy to report that after reading The Story You Need to Tell from cover to cover, I'm feeling ready to step back up to the writing plate after having taken a break from the project for the last several years. I've been very much looking forward to this conversation, and I'm thrilled to have Sandra here with me today. So welcome, Sandra Marinella, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Kim Corbin. What an introduction. It's an honor to be here.
Yay. Well, I'm really looking forward to talking to you more about the book. And I'd like to start by having you tell us more about your story and how you came to write The Story You Need to Tell.
Well, I think you really did hit it on the head. I found when I had breast cancer in 2012 that I turned to my writing, and I realized I automatically always turn to my writing when I hit a rough spot in my life. And I could look back and see that I probably became a reading and a writing teacher because I found that the power of words was just such a healing force in lives. And I had watched it for so many years with my students change and help them write their lives forward. So the first thing I did in 2012, New Year's, right after New Year's, I was diagnosed with cancer. I went out and bought a bright red journal and dubbed it my cancer journal. And I began to work my way through that. And in that long, difficult year, it was, I think, after my surgery, I'm sure it was after my surgery for my double mastectomy, that it felt like the universe sent a ray of light down and said, this is really what you need to do. You have spent your life teaching writing and using writing to help yourself navigate difficult times. And so it's very, very important now that you take what you have learned and give that back. And that was very much a part of my own healing process, turning to my journals and my writing and reading them and saying, is this right? Does this really matter? Can this really help other people? And of course, the research and my findings were so profound that it became very clear that I needed to write the story you need to tell.
And I love how in the book you call it a glimmer from the universe. It really sounds like that was a moment of calling for you.
It was absolutely a wonderful moment of calling. I had awakened and I was excited. My friends were in the kitchen making vegetable lasagna, and one friend had planted daisies outside. So I awoke, and it was a little bit crazy because the wind was blowing through the room. It was a beautiful spring day, and I just had this wonderful feeling that, wow, I'm blessed to have cancer. And I thought, that's not right. How can I feel blessed to have cancer? But everything around me was so perfect. And then the light came sort of in through the window, and I'm looking at my journal. And honestly, I thought, this is a moment of meaning. This is what you've been doing. This is who you are, who you've always been. And it's what you can give back to all these wonderful people who are out in the kitchen making the vegetable lasagna and planting the plants. I think we all know that giving back and having the chance, the opportunity to give back in meaningful ways can really transform our lives and make life just so fulfilling. And that's obviously what has happened for me with this ability to put this book out.
Well, I'm so grateful to you for using your challenging time to give this gift to us all. And in the story you need to tell, you write, "It does not matter if you've ever explored writing or picked up a journal. Even a limited amount of personal writing can guide you toward personal change. Simply telling your story helps." So will you tell us a little bit more about how giving words to our stories can change us?
Oh, yes, I'm going to turn to a story because I saw this time and time again in my classroom. I would have a student who was really struggling and at a loss and not sure of what was going on. And I'm thinking particularly of a student named Ben who sat in the back of my classroom about 10 years ago. And he was angry and upset and not talking to other people. And it was a very difficult time in his life, and I could sense that. And I kept trying to ask him what had happened. I would stop and talk with him as he'd go out the classroom door. And eventually I realized that he was indeed recording in his journal little bits and pieces of what had happened. And eventually he admitted to me, well, my uncle last summer, he died. And he began to write about that in his journal. Eventually he wrote a narrative in the classroom, and he was able to share that with others. And he was not a natural writer. I mean, he made it so clear, I am not a writer. I'm not someone that does this. But he shared that story, and I think he saw the power of sharing that as his classroom narrative and the reaction of the students. And we were all so moved. His uncle had committed suicide, and it had been a horrible thing for this young man because he was very close to this uncle who had been a veteran, and they had spent their summers doing all kinds of things. So just watching this in my classroom, this magic of people who think they don't write, and they put the story out there in any possible way that they can, seeing the change in them, and watching them drop their fear of words, their fear of grammar, their fear of things that stop us from our writing.
That's a great segue for my next question, which was, what would you say to someone who's struggling with that "I can't write, I'm not a good writer" voice that, is stopping them from kind of going into this?
Sure. I actually love that question because I always felt the non-writers were my greatest challenge, and I looked so forward to working with them and trying to help them, first of all, fire the critic. I think we all have a critic inside that tells us, no, you can't do this. You're not able to do this. You don't write well. You don't have the story straight. Your grammar's poor. Your spelling is bad. So I first try to encourage people to let go of those things and accept new rules. Accept that you have the freedom to put your writing out there as you need to put it out there. I've worked with writers who can write poems endlessly, but that's it. I mean, they can't write anything else. If that's your venue, if that's your way of getting your story out, then that's what you should do. So it's often hard for people to get past those initial roadblocks that we put in front of ourselves. But first, I encourage people to take those down. And if you still feel that you're not a writer, that you won't write, there are different ways to approach this. When my father was dying 2 years ago, he said to me, "Sandy, I want to leave you my stories, but you know me, I don't write. I don't want to write." And so we began by, I was writing his stories. I would go in and help him and transcribe his stories for him. And some days when I couldn't go, he would tape stories for me. And slowly but surely, I mean, this was really ironic. One day I went over and he was furiously writing a story. And I said, Dad, what's going on here? He goes, "Oh, you're messing my story up. I want you to have it the right way." So I think that there's a number of ways. A couple of weeks ago, I was working with an MS patient who was struggling and could no longer write, and he was telling me that he had found a way to have his stories taped, and he was so excited that he could still hold on to his stories and would still be able to give the body of those stories to his family. So,
wow, that's powerful.
Thank you.
So there's a lot of people out there right now who are feeling traumatized by the violence and divisiveness that's going on in our world. And I'm wondering if that's something that writing can help with as well.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, we have had a very difficult year, I think, in this culture and in all cultures, I guess. But I have found that a lot of people have come to me and asked me to do workshops on that very aspect, on how can we survive and how can we monitor and write our way through. And it's hard because there is a process. And sometimes when you're traumatized, the logical pattern that I've studied and learned says that initially you may not be able to write. You may need time to adjust to what has happened. For example, I think post-election, many people were traumatized with what was going on either side of the fence, and they had a hard time managing it. And I think we saw a lot of ranting and raving going on Facebook and on other venues as a result, and that's really hard. I personally felt, I need a little bit of downtime with this. I need to pull back and get my head around how things are changing and move forward. And so I think there is often, I always think of Elie Wiesel, the famous author, how he said that initially when he left the concentration camps, he wanted to write about what he had experienced, but he needed time for silence. He needed quiet to adjust to the story. And it took him 10 years before he was able to write the book Night. But once you feel you are ready, then I think it is important to break your silence and move forward and try to address what is happening to you. Try to put the story out there, because it's only then that you can accept it and begin to make sense of it. And that, while writing is cathartic when you do this, the best part of the writing process is that it will give you in your trauma a chance to make sense of what's happening. And it's only then that we can take a broken story that is in our heads and take it from our left brain, or our right brain, where it's just tumbling around and struggling, and begin to move it to our left brain and align it and make some sense of it so we can work with it and move forward with our lives.
Yes. Here's a quote from The Story You Need to Tell. "If we do not reflect on our experiences, we stand in danger of losing ourselves. Our pain can claim our narratives and lead us into rocky terrain." And you go on to say, "If we cannot edit our painful life stories and move forward, we will face an ongoing war with our rumination and our demons, and we may fall prey to depression and other illnesses." So could you talk a little bit about the difference between rumination and self-reflection?
Oh, yes. And I will use myself as an example. In looking back through my 27 journals, I think the thing that was the most painful for me was to realize that in my early 30s, I had gone through some very serious bouts with rumination, that I had allowed a story. I was teaching full-time. My husband was working full-time and starting a business, and I had just had my second child. So I had 2 little children to care for, essays to grade at night. I was really overwhelmed by life. And so in my journal, and I really had no time to see a counselor. I know I thought about it, but it was just something I couldn't do between picking the kids up at daycare and taking one to soccer practice and making dinner. I could not get to a counselor. So I did write in my journal, but I see that I was for a very, very long time stuck. I was repeating the same story over and over and over again, my struggle over and over and over again, and trying to decide if I should move to a high school that was on the other side of town. They kept offering me a job and inviting me and encouraging me to make this move, but I was so stuck with all my problems. I was stuck. I couldn't make logical decisions. I couldn't move forward. And it took a while before I realized that I had to stop that and I had to reflect. And I see that in my journal. I see some poems coming into it and some thought that I began, thought processes that I began to have and I began to write about. And I realized there I was starting to reflect on this and beginning to make sense of it. And by golly, I ended that broken journal, the one where I kept telling the bad stories over and over. I ended that journal and went out and bought another one because I thought, no, this is a new story. I'm going to write this story differently. And I did. I did write it. I moved forward. I changed jobs. And I made changes that were good for my family and good for me.
That's great. Here, this is kind of a follow-up quote from the book about that as well. You say, by writing to make better sense of your story, we can avoid drowning in our ruminations and painful emotions. We can take a shattered story and remake ourselves. We cannot change the facts, but we can change how we interpret those facts, how they affect us, and eventually how they teach us about our vulnerabilities and strengths. So is it important as we're writing to kind of have that intention of and that awareness of seeing our way through? It sounds like in your journal that happened kind of organically, but I imagine that, as with everything, intention can be really important.
Intention is absolutely important. I think in my 30s, I did not understand this process. And I think one of the reasons I was inspired to write the book is I could look at my journal and see, whoa, this is a pattern. And although we can experience it differently and it can work differently for each of us, it very clearly was not just a pattern in my life. It was a pattern in all of the 100 people plus that I interviewed for the book. I could see that when they got stuck and ruminated and refused to find their way forward, refused to reflect, they were going to have a hard time. But if you're conscious and set your intentions and say, this is where I want to head, this is who I want to be, these are the goals I have for me. And once I began to do that in my journal, it became very, very clear that reflection was a powerful, that setting intentions and reflection, goals, all of them can be done so wonderfully in writing. I was listening to your wonderful podcast not very long ago with Mark Allen, and I love that he said that. I love that he said exactly that. I thought, oh, we have so much in common in the way that we think, because he was talking about how he really had, in coming out of his difficult 20s and moving into his 30s, he really had to set his intentions. He really had to set his goals. And he said, and I had to put them in writing. You absolutely have to put them in writing. And I thought, yes, because that's what gives us that chance to reflect, to see ourselves in the mirror, and then do something better with that self we see in the mirror.
Yeah, and to take the kind of the emotional same thing and really ground it in a more of a physical form.
Yes, I love the way you said that. Yes, I think the writing grounds us. It absolutely grounds us. It allows us to steady ourselves and say, hey, I'm each foot is moving forward on this journey.
Yes. Here's another quote from the story you need to tell that I really enjoyed. We all face challenges in a world that has been defined by politics, economics, terrorism, and social media. Life is fraught with difficulties, both large and small. If our goal is to find our way through those snags and stresses, then we are called to undertake our own personal hero's journey. So will you tell us a bit more about the hero's journey and how it relates to writing?
Oh, my goodness. I have been a fan of Joseph Campbell and the hero journey since I was very young. Yes, I am thrilled to tell you that, because in interviewing both veterans and cancer patients, when I found out I had cancer and started on the journey to write this book, I felt that the most important thing I could do was work with those who would need it the most. And in my experiences at the time, I was working with cancer patients, and I knew they needed it. So I took my work to several cancer centers here in Phoenix, and then I also went downtown to work with veterans at the Veterans Hospital. And I was absolutely amazed at what I learned about their journey and how each one, as they slowly told their story, as their story became revealed, I could look at the pattern and see it's the hero's journey. We are all out there trying to find, we may be refusing to take the journey, we may be holding back, there may be pushback, But we can usually see that we have a challenge and that we have to rise up and meet that challenge, whether we're a cancer patient or a postpartum mom or a veteran struggling with bad memories from a war. We have to rise up and take that journey and move forward. There are mentors available for us. We need to march forward and find our story. And I had such wonderful, wonderful response to this when I went to the Omega Institute to a writing workshop back there a couple of years ago. I was talking with a lot of the writers at this writing workshop with Cheryl Strayed, and I said, do you feel you're on the hero journey? And I cannot tell you, they all, at first they'd pull back and then they'd think about what they were experiencing and they'd say, we are all called in our own way. We are all called to try to find our way up and out of the difficulties that are presented to us, because everybody, every single one of us is going to have difficulties and challenges presented. So we need to find our path up and out. And Joseph Campbell wisely showed us that that's the pattern, that's our story.
Yeah, it's funny with my skipping journey when it first began, and it was instant success. I got all this national publicity, and I, at the time, didn't know about the hero's journey, and I just thought that my path was going to be this straight shot upward, and it was going to be skipping happily ever after. Little did I know that, I had really found a big life calling here, and so I went through a very deep, dark night of the soul, and now I realize that the dark night of the soul is really, that's what makes a story, right?
Yes, yes. Without the darkness, we can't have the growth. We can't reach up. We can't change. We can't become better people.
Yeah. And I worked with a developmental editor quite a few years ago. Like, I've written my whole story down. But at the time, she said, you've gone through the dark night of the soul, that's happened, but you don't know yet what the kernel of meaning or theme you're going to bring back is. So is there always the kind of a theme or kernel of meaning in each story?
I think that everybody, the end of their story gives them something different. But I like to think that the best ending for our story is our wisdom, is the wisdom we can take from the journey and share with others, that we can give to others. And I think in practically everyone I've worked with, I find the beauty and the wisdom of what they have learned and what they can do, and often what they're giving back as a result.
Yes. So you already talked a little bit, which I so appreciate too, is that there's times when it's okay not to write. And that's something that with my story, it's like, this is an unfolding story, and right now is not the time to write. So I love that you give that permission in your book.
Absolutely.
And then you go on and say, once we've reached an understanding of our trauma, we can write about it. At this juncture, writing can give us insights to find resolution for pain and perhaps an end to our story. At the very least, writing will grant us a framework for living with our pain and a roadmap to guide us forward. So what are the first steps for someone who feels ready to start giving words to their story?
Oh, I think probably what you need to do, if you are ready, is I think the book would help a lot. The story you need to tell, I tried to generate it with the prompts that would guide you forward, that would help you reach inside. And one of the best prompts, I think, is probably to look at chapters and experiences that you've had, and what story needs to be pulled out and what story needs to be shared. I think there are so many ways that you can approach this in terms of family stories, or any story that, looking at the music you've listened to, looking at the photos that you have, you begin to slowly pull those things together. So often when we feel we have a trauma, we feel we don't understand the details. We don't really know what happened. But it doesn't take much once you begin to write. And I love to begin with free writing. I think free writing works very well for me. But I also make space for different writers to write in different ways, because we all have to claim what I call our pattern and our practice. We all view this very, very differently. But I would certainly start probably with the book, or you can join a writing group. You can take a class. If you're in counseling, if you have a very difficult story, it is possible to join and work with a counselor. One of the most beautiful stories I have is the story of Barbara Lee, who was struggling, and she brought her story to us and wrote it and was able to share it with us, and it was powerful. You've got to be at the right place in the right time, but there are many options.
Oh, well, thank you. And the writing prompts in your book are fantastic. And I just thank you for using your breast cancer journey to bring this forward and to really see your hero's journey through to help us all. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate you being here with me today.
I loved it. Thank you so much.
For more information about Sandra Marinella and the story you need to tell, you can visit her online at storyyoutell.com. And I'd also like to invite you to join the New World Now podcast community on Facebook, where you can be a part of discussions about current episodes and stay up to date on the latest and greatest podcast news. Simply search for New World Now podcast on Facebook to join the group, and I'll hope to see you there and look forward to connecting on future episodes of New World Now.
Thank you for listening to New World Now with Kim Corbin from New World Library. New World Library publishes books and audios that inspire and challenge us to improve the quality of our lives and our world. For more information about their books and authors, you can visit them online at newworldlibrary.com.